So thank you all for joining us today for the Genocide and Human Rights Studies webinar series. My name is Megan Reed and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Throughout this series, we hope to provide a platform for learning about cases and theories of genocide and human rights studies. This series was created in response to COVID-19, which unfortunately led us to cancel this year's annual Genocide and Human Rights University program. This 2-week graduate level program hosted at the University of Toronto brings together 20 to 25 students from all over the world to learn from some of the most renowned scholars in their respective fields. The mission of the Institute's university program is to encourage a new generation of scholars to engage in research and publication in the field of genocide and human rights studies. To date, over 400 students from 40 different countries have graduated from this program, and many of them have gone on to do research, publish, teach, and raise awareness about the nature of genocide, the importance of human rights, and the necessity of genocide prevention. For more information on this program, my colleagues at the Institute will be sharing some website links in the chat box for everyone. I will also note that throughout this webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A chat box or raise your hand and you can answer some of the questions live that way. The discussion questions will also be posted in the Q&A chat box to get some ideas flowing for the Q&A session at the end of this session. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our panelists today, Professor Lorena Fontaine, who will be speaking on the Indigenous Peoples of North America. Professor Fontaine is a Cree Anishinaabe and a member of the Seg King First Nation in Manitoba, Canada. She is the Indigenous Academic Lead at the University of Winnipeg and an Associate Professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies. Professor Fontaine has taught for the First Nations University of Canada and the School of Public Policy graduate program at Queen's University. She has spoken nationally and internationally and has authored articles on residential school issues and Indigenous language rights in Canada. Her PhD research was presented in a CBC documentary entitled Undoing Linguicide. She has also worked with the Assembly of First Nations as an advisor on Aboriginal languages for a number of years. Since 2003, Dr. Fontaine has been an advocate for Indigenous residential school survivors, as well as their descendants. She was a task force member and a contributor to the Assembly of First Nations report on Canada's dispute resolution plan to compensate for abuses in Indian residential schools. Professor Fontaine also acted as a legal consultant to the Toronto law firm Thompson Rogers in a national class action on Indigenous residential schools. Most recently, Professor Fontaine has been involved with a digital storytelling project on the intergenerational legacy of residential schools. Last year, she was a co-organizer of an educational forum on the legacy of residential schools and the Holocaust with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She has also spoke at the Holocaust Education Week in Toronto on the legacy of memory and the impact of genocide deniers. Professor Fontaine, we are very happy to have you with us here today. Welcome. And I know you wanted to do some introductions with all of the attendees today. So I will ask if you could introduce yourself by raising your hand, and then you can introduce yourself live, or by sending us a quick message in the chat.
Yeah, and I was just wondering if everybody could, as they're introducing themselves, just tell me where they are right now, and if they've been to an Indigenous community, and if there's any Indigenous participants, where they're from.
Okay, we do have someone. So, let's see. Oh. So Alan Whitehorn, who lives in Kingston,
Okay.
is joining us.
And any of the others? It's strange because I can't see people.
I know, I know. If people raise their hands, I'll be able to turn on at least the audio. I think video too is an option.
Okay,
Alexi from Toronto has also.
okay,
Margarita Dadian from Armenia.
okay.
One of our colleagues, Jen from Toronto, is also joining us. Oh, we have a few people. So this is Joyce Apsel.
Right.
Hi, Joyce.
Hi, I can't seem to get my image on. I don't know how.
That's okay, we can hear you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Joyce Absol. I direct the course on genocide and human rights, sponsored by the Zoryan. I very much look forward to hearing your presentation. I've visited a number of Indigenous communities in Utah and New Mexico some years ago.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay. We have, who do we have here? We have a few people in the chat.
Okay. I can't see the chat.
Is it at the bottom of your screen? Do you see it?
No, it might be because my PowerPoint is up.
Okay, we have Aram Ajemian. He's from Ottawa. He attended Zoryan's first summer course in 2002. He has never visited an Indigenous community, but has interest in genocide studies. We have Marcia from Boston joining us. We have Lauren. She says, it's nice to meet you all. She's currently based in Portland, Oregon, but was previously residing in Vancouver, Canada. She's working as a housing worker and a legal advocate in the downtown East Side. Many of her clients are or were Indigenous women. Her research and her recently concluded MA in human rights also focused on the right to adequate housing for Indigenous women and genocidal and femicidal violence against them in Canada and Guatemala. So she looks forward to your lecture.
Great. Okay, so should I begin?
I think so. Does anyone else want to say hello? We have a few more people here. If you missed it, we're just doing quick introductions. Feel free to tell us where you're from and your background, and if you have experience visiting an Indigenous community or Indigenous yourself. We do have another message. Oh, it's from Varuja Vezian. He's actually one of the Zoryan Institute board members. He says he's here as well, listening. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining me today. And it's really important for me to to create a sense of community, and I've been trying to do this through Zoom. So thank you for participating and just letting me know where you're from and a bit about yourself. It's really helpful for me to know who I'm speaking to today. So I'm going to be speaking about genocide, primarily the experience of Indigenous peoples in Canada, but I will touch a little bit about more broad history in North America. I'm also going to be talking about genocide in terms of a process. So it's one that Indigenous peoples continue to experience in a variety of ways today. And there's two central aspects of Indigenous group life. The two aspects are very integral to our group life and our cultural identity. The first one is land, of course, and then the second one is language. Language is going to be the one that I'm going to focus primarily as an example of genocide within Canada. And I just wanted to start off the conversation a little bit about how I got into this work, because it speaks to the reason why language has become such a predominant issue for Indigenous peoples in Canada. So I started off as a lawyer that worked on land title cases in the United States. I was going to graduate school, and I had the opportunity to work on land title cases for Indigenous peoples in Belize and Nicaragua. And those cases went before the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. When I came back to Canada, there was, the residential school claims were just starting probably about 2001. They had started in the late 90s, but they really started to pick up in the 2000s. So by the time I got back to Canada, those cases were increasing. By 2003, there were 10,000 claims filed against the federal government and the churches in Canada for the abuses that Aboriginal people had experienced. And it was at that time that I started working on a national class action suit. And what I found out that 90% of Aboriginal people that had filed residential school claims were using the word genocide. They were articulating that their experience very much was one of genocide. But they also talked about loss of language and culture. And that seemed to be one of the issues that was central to their case, but also they were thinking about the future of their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. They wanted to leave a legacy of their cultural identity. And the lawyers that I was working with didn't know what to do with that part of their claim. What they said was that Aboriginal people didn't have language rights in Canada. That was the common statement made to Indigenous people during that time that had a residential school claim. And part of that reason that lawyers were giving that response is because in our Constitution, we have French and English that has been identified as the official languages of Canada. And there is a series of constitutional rights for English and French speakers in Canada. There's even a clause that talks about that children have a right to be educated in either English or French. But there was nothing that said in our Constitution that Indigenous people had any right to language. That really stumped me, and because I had been working more internationally where language rights, linguistic rights, and cultural rights were just a given to all people. In Canada, that wasn't the case in terms of looking at rights of Indigenous peoples. I was thrown back by this as well because I grew up in a home that was multilingual. On my father's side, we're Ojibwe speakers, or in our language, we say Anishinaabe. On my mother's side, we're Cree speakers. Both my parents are fluent in those languages. My grandparents actually didn't speak English, and I was sent to a French immersion school. So I would go to school in speaking French. I'd come home, and there would be this kind of odd relationship with language, because anytime my parents would speak in our ancestral language, they would turn their back so that I couldn't see. My grandparents would speak in our ancestral language, and my parents or my aunts and uncle had to translate. And that to me was normal until I started thinking about these claims that were coming before the law firm that I was working for at the time. And I also realized that I had a lot of personal shame about my cultural identity, and particularly my language. I found out after digging through my family history that my grandparents actually hid my aunts and uncles one at a time on our family trap line so that they would not lose the language. And during this time, they could have been put into prison or fined or both. It was against the Indian Act which was federal legislation that applied to only Indigenous peoples in Canada, that if parents did not send their children to these schools, they could be fined or imprisoned. And because my grandparents were hiding my aunts and uncles on the trap line during school time, they could have been imprisoned or fined. But they risked it. They risked their freedom to ensure that the children, my aunts and uncles, would remain language speakers. And when I reflected on that history, I decided that I was not going to pass on this legacy to my children. I have since developed some close relationships with a number of children of Holocaust survivors because I went looking for literature during this period that would speak to the descendants that experience trauma. What kind of impact does that have on the children? And so I found a lot of literature and a lot of a great community within the Jewish community to read, but also to develop relationships. Since that period, I have been looking at the area of linguicide because when you look at what is happening now in our schools is that Indigenous children still do not have the choice to learn their language. The majority of families now speak English at home. Schools are a central place for us to revitalize our language and our culture. And yet children do not have access to immersion programs in the community or outside of the reserve system. Now, I'm not saying that on a broad basis. There are some communities that are implementing language programs. There are some communities that are implementing immersion programs, but they do this at great cost. They are usually bare bones funded. They're generally teachers that are over 65 running these schools, and there's very little funding available for Indigenous people to run these programs. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a little bit later in the presentation. So that gives you a little bit of background of why I started doing research in this area, but why the focus has been on language. At the end of the presentation, I wanted to see if we could have a bit of a discussion on the legacy piece. So I'm just going to read out these questions and then read them out again at the end of the presentation for us to maybe have a bit of dialogue. So what sort of things do genocides from other countries have to teach us about the experience of Indigenous peoples in North America? And then what do you consider to be primary legacies of genocidal violence? Now, I'm going to be covering the legacy of language loss. How do these legacies complicate attempts to secure reconciliation or redress in the wake of historical trauma in Canada specifically? And what kinds of burdens does the work of repair place on the shoulders of survivors? So these are residential school survivors, Indigenous peoples in Canada, as well as their families, their descendants. And then, of course, the allies of Indigenous peoples. So I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly who are Indigenous peoples and more globally. There's approximately 370 million Indigenous peoples across 70 countries worldwide. There's no official definition of Indigenous peoples, but generally most look at the 1978 Cobo report. Martinez Cobo was the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Rights at the time, and established a definition that is generally used. And the focus is really on articulating Indigenous peoples as nations, communities, and peoples. We have a deep connection to our land, resources, and culture. It's often referred to pre-colonial times that we had our own systems of government, our legal systems, and social institutions that are very much a part of our life today. The population of Indigenous peoples in North America, and these are broad numbers. It's hard to get exact numbers, but pre-1492, when Columbus entered into North America, there was approximately 8.8 million to 112 million Indigenous peoples. Over 5 centuries, 7 to 18 million people died. And this was a result of extermination campaigns by European settlers. There were massacres in Central to Southern America. There were disease brought on by European settlers, slavery and removals, and of course starvation that occurred within North America. I'm going to give you just an example here of what the state did to Indigenous peoples up here in Canada in the prairies, and as well in the southern part, southern central part of the US. The buffalo was an integral part of our livelihood, but also our food system. Before the 1800s, there were so many buffaloes in this part of the world that it was said that it took several days to see a herd of buffalo pass on the prairie landscape. This picture was taken in 1892 in Detroit, Michigan, and these are buffalo skulls. In Canada and the US, there was a concerted effort by government to destroy the buffalo. And in fact, I found this slogan by, or this statement by in 1880 by a US colonel that said, "Kill every buffalo you can, every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." So there was a concerted effort to target the buffalo because the state at the time realized that our food source was very dependent on the buffalo. If we did not have that, we would likely starve. In the prairies in the 80s, they were building the railway across Canada, and this was very much a part of the plan, was that to starve Indigenous people, it would force them into signing treaties and destroying their ability to assert title over their land. And by the 1870s, most of the buffaloes in the prairies had been slaughtered and affected Indigenous people's food sources, and also forced a lot of Indigenous people into signing away land rights. As you can, so this is a map of the United States. This sort of depicts the land loss that occurred in the United States. I'm going to just use I think there's a highlighter here that's the wrong one. Oh, here it is. Okay. So in the United States, the goal for land was actually to force migration east to west. There were a lot of removals. There was the forced migration of Indigenous peoples from their traditional territory in this area out to the west. There was the 1830 Indian Removal Act that forced a number of Indigenous people. Some of you might have heard of the Trail of Tears, where Indigenous people from Oklahoma were forced to leave their homes. A lot of them died as they traveled west and were relocated to in the western area. The other thing that occurred along with these removals was that Indigenous peoples were placed on very small plots of land. And as you can see, like these are the reserve land base that Indigenous people have in the U.S. If you right here is where the Navajo Nation sits, and I'm told that if you put all the reservations in Canada into this region here, it would not cover even the land base that the Navajo people have. So you can see the significant depletion of Indigenous people's land, but also the ones that were removed from their territories. The forced migration that occurred also occurred in Canada. Some Indigenous people are no longer living on their land. Some people in the United States do not even know where their people are, the people that formed their traditional territories anymore, because they do not have a land base. In Canada, the focus over the past 40 years has been on the residential schools. This is a quote from Prime Minister MacDonald from the House of Commons in 1883 that really set the stage for residential schools to occur in Canada. Residential school policy was designed to separate Indigenous children from their homes and communities, and the goal was to enforce primarily English. There were some schools that taught French, but also to remove Indigenous children from the cultural influences of their families and their communities. But there was also a lot of stereotypes, stereotypical images that were created about Indigenous peoples during this time. The word savages was repeatedly used in a lot of policy during this time. It depicted Indigenous peoples in very stereotypical images that are very predominant today in the minds of a lot of Canadians and Americans. I'm just going to show you this powerful painting by Kent Monkman. He's a Cree artist from Fisher River, Manitoba. It's a community fairly close to Winnipeg, where I am speaking to you from. And this depicts children being taken from their communities during the residential school period. It was painted in 2017, but it's a powerful image of what had been occurring in Canada and the US from the late 1800s to probably the 1960s, although the last residential school closed in Canada in 1996. So by the time residential school claims were being launched, and genocide was very much being articulated as the experience Indigenous peoples faced in the residential school system, there was a class action suit launched against the federal government and a settlement agreement that was established in 2005. From that settlement agreement, we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that looked at the impact of the residential schools. The mandate was really to record and document the truth of this history. there was 6,000 testimonies that the commission documented, 6,000 testimonies from survivors and descendants and other people impacted by the residential schools. And there was a a 6-volume report that came from the testimony and the history that the TRC documented, as well as 94 calls to action. The calls to action are designed for the federal government and other Canadians to reconcile and to create changes within Canada to deal with the legacy of the residential schools. But the other thing that occurred was the TRC identified what happened in the schools as cultural genocide. And here they talk about that the policy in Canada was not just to eradicate language and culture, but it was to eliminate Aboriginal governments, ignore Aboriginal and treaty rights through a process of assimilation. There hasn't been this kind of commission or court claims within the US. So a lot of scholars, as well as Indigenous peoples in the US, have looked to this report. I was involved in a digital storytelling project that occurred in 2010, and we recorded 35 descendants of residential school survivors. And we created a toolkit that we circulated to Indigenous communities in Canada and the US so that they could develop a similar project to document the voices of the descendants of these schools. And we had a number of people in the US that would call the ones that were involved in the project crying because there was finally something that the communities could work on to identify the legacy of the schools. So I think that there's still a lot of work to be done in Canada and the US to not only identify what happened in the schools, but for descendants to be able to talk about the legacy of the schools. I just brought up this map because it shows the diverse language landscape within North America that was very much impacted not only by these schools, but also by the general policy of assimilation within Canada and the US, North America. There were approximately 300 Indigenous languages that were spoken in Canada and the US. All these languages now are endangered. This map shows the degree of endangerment within Canada. If you look at the statistics, or sorry, the Stats Canada website, it'll identify approximately 52 Indigenous languages spoken in Canada. But if you look at the international sources like UNESCO, this map that UNESCO put out, they've identified about 87 different Indigenous languages in Canada. It's predicted that only 3 of these languages in Canada is going to survive. 2 of them are languages from my family, Ojibwe and Cree. And I can say for certain that if something significant is not done, that we are going to lose these languages, Ojibwe and Cree, within the next 2 generations. One of the languages that are that has also been identified as one that is fairly safe is Inuktitut. So this is a language that's spoken in northern Canada. So in the white part here is where Nunavut is, where people speak Inuktitut. And I just wanted to, because the diversity of the language landscape is quite profound just in Canada alone. I thought that I would focus in on Inuktitut to give you just an example of the damage that's been done of this policy to eradicate Indigenous languages in North America. So in Nunavut, in the northern part of Canada, there's approximately 65,000 Inuit people. Approximately half are currently living in Nunavut. Within Nunavut, 63 of the population reported as speaking Inuktitut as their mother tongue. I would probably say that this number's higher than that, but it's a significant portion of the population. Inuit peoples, societal health as well as educational goals was very much tied to the land as well as being able to speak Inuktitut. Elders would bring children and youth onto the land to be able to learn about not only their cultural identity, but also the ability to live on the land, to learn about gender appropriate knowledge, to be able to share stories. And the basis of the cultural identity is very much ingrained within the ability to pass on this knowledge that is very much land-centered. And in fact, when the Inuit people signed their land claims agreement, the elders talked about that they wanted to make sure that the language of the Inuit people was protected because it's so connected to their ability to pass on their land knowledge. As a result, the Inuit people have legislation that is supposed to protect their language that is very much connected to the land claim settlement agreement. The Inuit people in the north were impacted by the residential schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of their volumes is very much dedicated to the Inuit experience. I've just got the... I wanted to focus now a little bit on the impact of language loss in education, in the healthcare system, as well as in federal services provided to Inuit people, in the justice system, as well as with the way that police is provided within the north. So 90% of Nunavut students in Nunavut are Inuit. In spite of that, there's 75% of the teachers are English-speaking non-Inuit individuals. There are 42 schools in Nunavut. Out of those 42 schools, 7 deliver education in Inuktitut up to grade 4, and 1 delivers Inuktitut up to grade 5. It is predicted at this rate that by 2051, 4% of the population will speak Inuktitut. So what's occurring here is that because of the shame that's occurred from the residential schools, the inundation of English within the education system, that Inuit people are not speaking Inuktitut as much in the homes in some of the more central centers. But Inuit children go into the school system speaking fluent Inuktitut and come out of the school not being able to speak their language fluently because they're inundated by English. They also become ashamed of speaking Inuktitut. And as a result, they don't do well in school. They have one of the highest dropout rates in the world. And that's primarily because Inuit children, by the time they get into junior high, are not doing well in school in English, and they are not speaking Inuktitut. They're very much ashamed of their culture. They don't see a part of their identity in the schools and end up dropping out. Within the healthcare system, there has been reported deaths over the past few years because healthcare workers do not primarily speak Inuktitut. They're unable to communicate with Inuit people. Inuit people are unable to describe their symptoms or understand the medication that they're receiving. They don't understand the dosages or the warning of the medication that they receive. As a result, there has been Inuit elders primarily that have died because of this. In 2017, most recently, the Nunavut Coroner identified that lack of adequate health services was a direct contributing cause in the death of tuberculosis patients in Nunavut. And the result of this was because the healthcare providers were not able to communicate in Inuktitut, and the Inuit patients were not able to talk about their what they were experiencing health-wise. Inuit, the inability for Inuit people to speak to the police or to healthcare providers, or to alert the police of domestic disputes, to talk about some of the experiences that they are experiencing within the justice system have been severely impacted because people within the justice system, but also that are providing healthcare, federal services to Inuit people do not speak Inuktitut, and Inuit people find it very difficult to communicate what is happening in their community and in their home in English. Most recently, last year, there was a lawsuit launched by a family in Ponlet Inlet in Nunavut, alleging that the failure of the RCMP to investigate in a youth that had been experiencing trouble in their community was shot. And he was not able to articulate to the RCMP what he needed at the time. He was in severe poor health. The RCMP assumed that he was drunk, and when the young boy lunged towards the RCMP to try to get help, the RCMP officer shot him. So there is now an investigation into this death, but the Inuit people from this community have attributed that death to the ability to, well, as a language issue. There's been a report recently in Quebec that talked about a lot of the issues that Inuit people face within their communities related to police services are related to language issues. I just realized I've been talking a lot. So this is just a quote by Stephen Lewis, who had heard about what happened to the Inuit and the language issues that they were experiencing in 2017. It was in response to the report that came out and talked about the language and cultural issue as being very much a human rights issue. So the legacy that language loss has, that the Inuit are experiencing in Nunavut, just to recap, 70% of the youth leave school by grade 10 because of language-related issues. 52%. There's a lot of poverty because Inuit do not have high school education. It's very difficult for them to find jobs. As a result, homes are overcrowded. There's lower life expectancy. There's high suicide rates within Nunavut. 70% of Inuit homes face food insecurities because of poverty. There's still health issues that are quite significantly higher than most Canadians because of language related issues. So Inuit leaders within Nunavut have launched a complaint to the UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues for the language-related issues that they're experiencing today. There was a Languages Act that was passed last year that did not adequately deal with their language issues, so they're going to the international arena. So I'm just going to quickly end. It's just a 2-minute clip, and then I wanted to open it up for questions and comments. Okay, now I'm having trouble with this.
I'm wondering if the pointer, is that it maybe? If we get rid of the pointer, maybe it'll
do that. Okay.
Maybe. There we go. There we go. Yeah.
Reconciliation. It's a word you often hear, especially when discussing the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. But in light of recent events, some aren't sure they even want to talk about reconciliation anymore. When a 15-year-old Anishinaabe girl was found dead, dumped in a river, and no one was held responsible, and a young Cree man was shot dead, and the shooter was acquitted. Both of these recent cases have re-exposed a deep rift between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. It's a divide that goes back hundreds of years. When Europeans arrived in North America and began settling the land, they didn't stop at just taking land from Indigenous peoples. They brought with them a policy to snuff out the so-called Indian problem. The first Indian residential schools started opening in the 1870s, the beginning of what some have called the darkest chapter in Canadian history.
What took place in residential schools amounts to nothing short of cultural genocide.
By 1920, the Indian Act was amended to make it mandatory for status Indian children to attend residential school. When their parents refused to send them away, police showed up and forcibly took them. It's estimated that 150,000 children were taken from their families and placed in these schools where they were stripped of their culture and their language. The goal was assimilation, to quote, kill the Indian in the child. Thousands of children died, with some estimates saying the mortality rate was as high as 60% in some of the schools. Those who survived have shared horrific stories of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. The last residential school closed in 1996. The impacts of those institutions are still palpable today. Indigenous communities have shown incredible resilience in the centuries since Europeans arrived, but the impacts of intergenerational trauma and colonization still run deep. In 2007, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history recognized the damage inflicted by residential schools. Canada formally apologized the following year.
These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some saw it, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
The residential school settlement agreement established a multi-billion-dollar fund to support survivors in their recovery. One of the outcomes of this agreement was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The commission traveled across the country, heard testimony from thousands of residential school survivors. In 2015, the commission produced its final report. It included 94 calls to action, calls meant to redress the legacy of the residential school system, and hopefully lead to reconciliation. So what's changed since then? Some ask if this country has even grasped the truth of our shared history. What actions have been taken? How far have we come? Indigenous people currently account for roughly 5% of the population, and yet nearly half of all the children in care in this country are Indigenous. More than a quarter of the adults locked up in prisons are Indigenous. The national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls may be well underway, but the deaths and disappearances continue today. It's time to take a hard look at this country's progress on reconciliation.
Thank you very much.
So I'm sorry I went over.
No, that's okay.
I'm just going to go back to our questions.
Do you mind increasing your volume a little bit from your end?
Second.
I think it's better. Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, I covered quite a bit, and I just wanted to say part of the reason why I've been focusing on the language issue, because it's one of the areas that I think is one of the major issues that are facing Indigenous people in terms of our ability to pass on the cultural identity to our children. Language is incredibly important, not only to our identities, but also our knowledge of our land, and our ability to live on the land, our connection to land. Our elders talk about that history within our language, and our ability to teach our children their cultural identity and about our relationship to land is very much dependent on not only our language, but our schools to be able to provide that education. So it's one of the legacies, one of the many legacies, that Indigenous people are dealing with. But I was hoping that people that are participating today would be able to talk about either experiences from other countries that might be able to lend itself to talk about redress, but also about dealing with the trauma that Indigenous peoples still face within Canada.
So we have quite a few questions in both the chat and the Q&A. Would you like me to read some of them out?
Sure. Okay, so I can see the.
Oh, perfect. Good.
Okay. So I'm going to maybe read them and hope. Okay. So I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about how allies who don't currently speak an Indigenous language can contribute to language preservation. Okay. Okay, I thought they might be all in the same, but they're all very different. I get this question a lot. I'll just do them one by one. There are a number of ways that Indigenous people, for example, in Canada, can become allies for the preservation of Indigenous languages. And one of those areas is to become advocates for immersion programs. The reality is that we need schools in our communities and in the urban centers for Indigenous peoples to be able to not only teach the language, but also to develop curriculum around our culture. And there are a lot of people that are still unaware of the impact that this history has had on languages. So education, I think, is really key, is to just become informed on the actual reality of language loss within Indigenous communities, and to become an advocate for immersion programs. You will probably be seeing in the next little while, Nunavut has launched a complaint against Canada to the UN. So to get informed in that area, I think would be really helpful, and to become advocates in support of their UN complaint is just one way.
That's great.
So what do you think of the concept of cultural genocide as was used to describe the residential school system, and how do you think it might be argued that the perpetrators of this policy in Canada are guilty of this as per the UN Convention? Well, it's actually one of the reasons why the TRC commissioners use the word cultural genocide in the report. Canada, they knew that Canada hadn't actually adopted the UN Convention on Genocide, and the way that the law works in Canada is if you don't implement these treaties, that it isn't law. So in order for the commissioners to say that genocide was committed and perpetrated by Canada, and for Canada to be found guilty of this crime, that Canada would have had to have adopted the UN Genocide Convention. But if you look at the language that they use to describe cultural genocide in the report, it very much falls in line with the definition of genocide. So I think that we often get caught up in the terminology of the definition under this convention. I know that scholars that are looking at this area are looking for the more broadly based definition that Raphael Lemkin had in terms of the impact on group rights, but the ability for a people's or a nation's or a community to protect their group life, their cultural life. So the definition in the TRC report, I think, was used strategically, but I think it does, it would fall in line with the Genocide Convention. That's a very loaded question, and there's, I think, a lot that there's more to be discussed about that. I'm just wondering, so when we can't see any of the participants, right?
We can hear them.
Okay.
Yep. So if people raise their hands, we can have people interact in talking to one another.
Yeah, because I was hoping that we might have more of a discussion at this point rather than me. You know, I've been talking a lot. I want to hear what other people have to say, and also comments they might have in sharing. So let's see. So
maybe
it's,
those who have already asked questions, if you feel comfortable, maybe we can raise our hands and kind of hear what you have to say with your voice so that it's more interactive, and maybe we can start a bit of a discussion. Okay, we have one. Margarita?
Sure, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
That's great. This was a wonderful, wonderful lecture. I'm an Armenian. I live in Armenia. I have many relatives who were survivors of the Armenian genocide in 1915. And that's why I think that genocide of the indigenous people is also very relevant to me as well. And when you were talking about the buffalo and how these people were forced to starve, I remembered about the history of Ukraine when what Stalin did with them in 1942 to 1943, when he would force them to starve because he shut down the food chain that was leading towards Ukraine, and 5 million people died because of that. And then when you were talking about the Trail of Tears, I remembered what happened with Armenians when Ottoman Turks were forcing them to move from historically Armenian lands where Armenians were living in the Ottoman Empire, and they were crossing the Derzor Desert to reach somewhere, and most of them were dying in the middle of the road. That's why I think this is really relatable to what happened to us Armenians, and that's the reason I really want to understand how we can fight against genocides so that it never happens again. And I have one question to you. This is something that I learned during a history class at my university, and I just want to know your opinion about this. So during our history class, my history teacher told me about Armenian orphans that survived the genocide, and they were sent to Canada to live a better life. But the reason for doing that was to keep their identity as Armenians. These were people aged from 2 to 12. So there were kids that would speak Armenian. But the orphanage director and the school director and the families, they wanted to change these Armenian orphans' names and teach them English so that they don't speak Armenian. I just wanted to know your opinion about these practices.
well, thank you for sharing that. That's, I think that any peoples who have ancestral language is incredibly important to their cultural identity. For us, it's central. And I think that no matter what the circumstances is, that whether it's for children to have a better future, for example, you were talking about Armenian children coming to Canada, that there should be assurances for the children to have a strong connection to their language because it's part of their identity. So I think that the ability for us to be able to talk about these experiences with one another, the transferring of children, Indigenous people would be very much advocates for maintaining the ability for these children to maintain their cultural heritage in their language. I think it's atrocious that they're being forced to speak English and cut their cultural ties to their language.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add to that or have a question? Feel free to raise your hands. Okay, we have a few here. Okay, Alexandra?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great, sorry. Thank you so much for that. as you can see, my question is a complete segue from what you were discussing. So apologies if you don't wish to discuss this. I've just always been really curious about what you were talking about the burden of reconciliation being on the shoulders of survivors. And in relation to that, the government's refusal to have unredacted documents sent to survivors, and also the fact that a lot of the documents for the independent assessment process, it looks like, I'm not sure about the update, will be destroyed, which what I understand was a ruling by the Supreme Court. So I know this is very specific, but I was wondering about what you can talk about with that process, about documents being destroyed, documents being redacted, and what that means for the reconciliation process.
Yeah, so during the court claims, there was, of course, the recording of what Indigenous people experienced. The independent assessment process, those were for the more severe claims for physical and sexual abuse. And those documents are now housed in a central location. And many survivors want those documents to live on. There are many survivors that don't. So even within my family, there was a number of disputes about some of my relatives that wanted those documents to be kept alive because it's part of the living history. And then there were others that didn't want anybody to know what had happened in those schools. So I think that it's a real crime for those that want those documents to be kept part of the living legacy history for future generations. And for those that want those documents destroyed, I think that should be, those wishes should be honored.
Thank you.
There's one here that I'm just gonna, it sort of caught my eye. They're all like incredibly important questions and very dense questions. But there's one here that asked about forming connections with children of Holocaust survivors. Could you speak a little bit more about how we can learn and benefit from forming connections with other groups, communities who have experienced genocide? I'm just going to give two examples. One is when I was starting to look for literature on trauma of the descendants of Indigenous people from these schools, there was nothing. So I started looking for literature that talked about the trauma from other genocides from other countries. And I found a book written by Helen Epstein called The Children of Holocaust Survivors. And I read the book and I identified so much with the shame that a lot of the descendants talked about that I wrote Helen Epstein and I told her. She responded and since then has put me into contact with some of the, well, one of the individuals in the book when I moved to Toronto. And that book really gave me a platform for me to be able to articulate what has happened to me. There is still a lot of silent shame in our communities, Indigenous communities, in Canada and the US about the loss of our language and culture. And it's sometimes easier to talk about these experiences with people from another trauma. So I was able to reach out to, to children of Holocaust survivors and to be able to talk about my experience and have it be validated. I have an uncle who has connected with a Holocaust survivor. And my uncle is very much open about the sexual abuse he experienced in the schools. I was told that a lot of Holocaust survivors aren't. But since this friendship was formed between my uncle and this Holocaust survivor, they both present regularly and speak about the sexual abuse that they experienced, one during the Holocaust, the other during the residential schools. So I think it allows us to open up dialogue with one another. I'll just give 2 examples. I think there's a lot of research, comparative research, that also has to be done as well.
Mm-hmm. We have a few more people with their hands up.
Okay.
Allow Professor Apsel. Joyce, can you hear us?
I think she's got to unmute herself.
Yeah, can you unmute yourself, Joyce? Joyce, can you hear us? Okay, maybe we'll come back.
Okay. I'm just going to read this comment from Lauren Grant, who's pointing to the 2019 Supplementary Genocide Report, of course, published by the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. There's a thorough analysis of genocide, both from the Roman Statute, 1948 Genocide Convention, but also provides a legal breakdown of the meaning of components of cultural genocide. So it's an excellent resource as well if people are interested in their research or in their writing.
Yeah, great. Okay. We have Professor Flavio. Let's see. All right. Unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Professor Lorena, thanks for your presentation. I'm from Brazil, right? And in our country, indigenous peoples are facing a very bad situation now. We have around 305 distinct indigenous nations in the country, with 274 different languages and around 90 different non-contacted indigenous groups. The Brazilian government is declared against their rights. Big infrastructures, constructions like dams, for example, violence from gold miners under the Brazilian government omission, fire in the forest, you must have heard about that in the Amazon, for example. So, and the health services are so bad, so failed, and do not observe their languages and cultural references. For example, have problems with the born of babies because they do not observe their cultural procedures, for example. Due to this fact, among others, the rate of death between the indigenous groups is increasing much more by COVID, for example, much more than between non-indigenous peoples. Can we consider it a kind of ethnocide or genocide, in your opinion? Thanks, Professor Lorena. Thanks, Megan.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that in question. It is a form of genocide. It's for a number of reasons. The first is that everybody should have a right to adequate health services. And when language becomes an issue, it's an issue of not only language rights, but human rights, the ability to access health care. I gave the Nunavut example that speaks to not only the loss of cultural identity that's very much tied to the language, but when you have healthcare providers that are not able to communicate to their patients, or when the patients are not able to communicate to their healthcare providers, it's not only a linguistic issue, a human rights issue, it becomes an issue of health and the ability for Indigenous people to access just primary health care. So I would look at that issue as being two-pronged. One is a linguistic rights issue, but also very much a human rights issue of being able to access adequate health care. And I would encourage you to follow the Nunavut's complaint, the Inuit complaint to the UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Rights over the next year, because the complaint very much articulates some of the legal issues that you've pointed out that's happening in Brazil.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
At the moment, we don't have any other hands up, so maybe we can take another from the Q&A.
Okay.
Oh, Professor Apsel has her hand up again. Let's see if we can connect. Hi, Joyce.
Hi, can you hear me? Hello, everybody. Hello, Flavia.
Hi.
Thank you for that presentation. It's a kind of a comment. One of the things in the course that we try to do on genocide and human rights is to make the links between the particular, and you have given us key insights into the particular history of what I would link of disposable people. And the case of the indigenous peoples of Brazil today, I think very much goes into that. And so the one of the things about pulling together indigenous peoples within the frame of talking about the particular case is, I think, that indigenous peoples often are on land that from Asia to Brazil to Canada to the US that people in power want. The question of assimilation and acculturation as being progress, that these kinds of methods and tropes are something that in the course we really tried to pull together. And I just wanted to share that with you. And here you gave a very compelling and terrible example of this being done to indigenous peoples in North America.
Well, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Okay, we do have another question here from Jenna. Hi, Jenna.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Lorena. That was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. I'm just noting, and also for myself, and I see that we have in the chat box a comment from Seda. Wondering if you have any book recommendations or further reading that maybe we can look into.
Oh, right. So there's one here that I just pulled up.
Okay.
So Colonial Genocide in Indigenous North America. It's an edited book by Andrew Wilford and Jeff Benvenuto and Alexander Hinton. It's a collection of articles written by US and Canadian scholars on colonial genocide, and it's an excellent resource. Somebody mentioned the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report that just came out, and there's a link right here to the report. It's also another excellent resource Andrew Wilford also has a comparative book on the residential schools in Canada and the US called The Benevolent Experiment, I think it's called, is another excellent resource. So those are the two books that I'd recommend. And within those publications and in the report, the bibliographies are quite good. So I would recommend looking in those as well.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, so there's one. Is there anybody else that's got their hand up? No?
No, I think we can go on to the Q&A.
Okay, so given the bleak statistics on language retention, can memory and cultural legacy still survive and perhaps evolve? Immigrant families also often lose language intergenerationally. I do. I still have a lot of hope within Canada. I'll just speak to that experience. I have seen students that decide to take up their language in their 20s and have very limited resources but are very dedicated that have become fluent in over 5 years. We still have communities, not a lot, but we have a few communities where there are a significant number of fluent speakers that are resources to us. I believe that the education system can be turned around to be able to have a significant impact on the revitalization of our languages if we act now in our school system. There are some languages within British Columbia on the eastern side of the country where there are only 2 or 3 speakers left, and their focus is on documentation. Yeah, their situation is very bleak, but I believe that with the ability to document these languages, that these languages could still be saved. But I'm sort of getting that the underlying question to this is, once the language is lost, is the culture still viable? I think it is, but I think that when you've got communities that have lost land base and their culture, it becomes very difficult. I come from a generation of women in my family that really believe that once the language is gone, that our culture dies with it. I don't tend to have that kind of view about our culture, but it's very much probably in my mother's and grandmother's generation's belief around that. So I think it's a conversation that that needs to occur in a lot of Indigenous communities. But I think that we can keep a culture alive, even if the language is severely endangered.
Lorena, we had an internal question, and it was kind of already addressed with the question about how we can be allies. But what, in your opinion, are the top 5 things that Canadians can do to support our Indigenous population here in Canada?
Well, the TRC calls to action is an excellent way to get involved. And the first thing is to be able to see what is in the calls to action, to identify what some of the, some of the recommendations by the TRC on how to address cultural genocide within Canada. The one thing that I would add is that the commissioners of the TRC were very clear that the calls to action is a base, but really foundation to implement what they put into the calls to action is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that is sort of the foundation to draw from which to how to implement the TRC calls to action. So for example, the calls to action might say that they want language rights recognized of Indigenous people in the Constitution, but the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples says that, yes, language rights, but we have to implement education systems that are designed by Indigenous peoples in order to revitalize Indigenous languages. So it gives it more teeth, but it gives a foundation to the calls to action in a more substantive way. So that's one way that I would recommend to get involved. Another way I think would be for people to just get to become more knowledgeable about the history. So there are 5 volumes that the TRC report put out. So just looking at even one of those volumes, they have a supplementary addition to the report where you can get an overview of all the 5 volumes. But just looking through the report, I think, is another way. Becoming for language issues, becoming an advocate for linguistic rights for Indigenous peoples right now, I think is really significant. I think more specifically advocating for immersion programs, access to funding for immersion programs that are on par with the immersion programs in Canada would be another way to support linguistic rights for Indigenous peoples. More broadly based, I think if you're going to be advocating for Indigenous rights more broadly, getting familiar with what's in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Taking courses like these, I think are significant for becoming allies to Indigenous peoples. And then I guess the last one that I would add is even just around the supper table when you're with friends or family to talk about these issues, because we still have a lot of genocide deniers. We have deniers of the history of the residential schools. I still hear it often by young and old people alike. It doesn't matter what age it's at. It's not generational. I think it's there's a lot of ignorance around this. When I teach on the topic of residential schools, it usually takes students that come in there with a lot of ignorance about 3 months for them to finally understand the implications of this history and its legacy today. So there's a lot of education that has to occur.
Great, thank you so much. I think we've addressed all of them. If we've missed any, I apologize. Feel free to send me an email or send Jenna an email, and perhaps we can coordinate with Professor Fontaine, who could help answer or address some of your questions if we have missed any. But thank you so much, Lorena. This was great. And if you are interested in learning more, please apply for the 2021 GHRUP coming up next August. We hope that everything is ready to go and safe for everyone to join us in person next year. And yes, if you have any questions or you want to participate in the student-led webinar, which will be happening on September 1st, if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.